Welcome to today's session on emerging trends in risk and governance. Today we will be discussing how governance has evolved over the past couple of years. We'll be looking at the increasing focus on risk and emerging risk, and we'll look at how those trends are likely to evolve as a result of COVID-19. So joining me today are Alison Baker. Alison's a non-executive director at CAS Minerals, Helios Towers, Endeavour Mining and Rockhopper Exploration. We also have Craig Murray, who's head of risk at Centamin, Mark O'Sullivan, who's director of corporate reporting at PwC, and Chris Stamp, who's a director at Ceradas. So just in terms of context, the volume of regulatory change and reform in governance and reporting over the past few years has been significant. We've seen a surge in non-financial reporting requirements, new governance and stewardship codes that place greater emphasis on purpose and culture, workforce and directors' duties. We're seeing increasing focus on ESG issues and corporate sustainability, and an even greater focus on stakeholders and the social agenda. Many companies find themselves grappling with new requirements and ever-changing stakeholder expectations, and the pressure to be accountable for social, environmental, and economic impacts continues apace. So my first question is for Mark. Mark, what are the biggest changes you have seen over the past 12 months, and how has COVID-19 changed the conversation?
Thanks, Claire. I think if we go back sort of 12 to 18 months, the main topic of conversation, which I think you mentioned at the outset, was very much around stakeholders and how boards demonstrate how they take stakeholders and long-term considerations into account in their decision making. Virtually every conversation we were having was how companies are going to be responding to that sort of dynamic stakeholder engagement, section 172, and in their reporting, at the same time as getting ready to respond to the changes to the 2018 code, which was very much driven around or responding to the number of high-profile corporate failures, and therefore the challenge of reducing the risk of corporate failure. So very much focused in on things like purpose, culture, in emerging risks. So those are sort of the moving parts. And then I suppose coming up quickly on the outside, and was going to be the topic for conversation for this year, was going to be climate change. So those are the sort of the big themes, and then COVID struck. And it's not that it changed things overnight for the companies that were in a place to report, because 90% of their reports were already done already. So we have seen, companies that have reported to date, I suppose, respond to that agenda in various different ways. Certainly stakeholder reporting has had a very positive impact, I think, in the way that companies report. But almost overnight, suddenly companies were grappling with the short term and going concern and risk management and business continuity. And those have been the key areas of focus. That's not to say that stakeholders and long-term considerations have gone away. And that's not to say that climate change has gone away. You can't socially distance from climate change, as Mark Carney has said recently. So they remain important and they remain relevant. I think what we're seeing at the moment is undoubtedly the need for greater transparency and accountability around going concern, around the outcome of stress testing scenario, reverse stress testing scenarios. We're seeing more companies having to be clear about how it has affected risk management and internal controls. But at the same time, I think we're seeing companies having to strike the right balance between shareholders and other stakeholders. So at the heart of that agenda that I was talking about, We're seeing a lot of focus on companies that might be furloughing employees, paying bonuses and LTIPs, taking government grants, paying dividends. And I think that will only increase over the coming months. And as we come out of the current crisis, however long it may last, I think we are going to start to see companies being challenged to better demonstrate the long-term sustainability of their business model, as the code encourages, and start to think about some of those medium to longer term agenda items that we were just talking about. So I think, a lot that we were talking about remained relevant, certainly for a lot of the companies that have reported to date, and remain relevant for companies as they report through the current reporting cycle and beyond.
Thank you, Mark. Does anybody else have anything in addition in terms of things that they've seen over the past 12 months to add to Mark's views? Okay. So Craig, you have recently released your Q2 results for Centamin. What are some of the key learnings that companies are starting to take and apply from COVID-19, specifically in relation to risk reporting?
Hi Claire, thanks very much for that. I think it follows up very much on what Mark was saying, which is the response to COVID in terms of how we have to think about reporting has been a bit of a short-term focus that everybody's needed to shift towards. Part of the reason for that has been just quite simply every organisation has had to respond to this in a very different way depending on how that's impacted them. So everybody's talking about COVID-19 as a risk. The pedantic within me says COVID's not an actual risk itself, it's a scenario where there's a lot of risks that have been associated with it. And what that means is companies have properly had to look at things that were probably quite static in their principal risks. They may have been talking about them previously, but they've never really had to do anything about it. And now they've actually materialized to a certain extent. So things around people, supply chain, governance, engagement with the government, all these topics have been things that have very much been brought to the forefront of discussion. So in terms of the question itself about the learnings companies are going to have to take is, it's been it's a horrible scenario, but it's been a fantastic situation for organizations, somebody like myself in a risk management space, to talk to people properly about, you can understand the impacts that these things can have. And this is the reason why we've been talking about risk, internal control, governance, all of these topics for so long, because fundamentally they're at the heart of how decisions need to be made. And I think a lot of what needs to be taken going forward, as Mark's been saying, the financial pressure is obviously huge. So things around going concern, the transparency of it. We've obviously discussed a lot around viability statements, and previously they were in there. People would include a viability statement, but certainly prior to joining Centamin, I was at PwC, and Mark and myself had this discussion often, is about the colour that was in those viability statements. There just needed to be more. There needed to be more transparency, scenario planning, all these types of things. So ultimately, the lessons that people are going to have to take forward is, how can they not just have completed this exercise and then shelve it again, but how do they continue to take the positives from this and how they've looked at things? And it's going to be moving forward. Mark was very much touching on the topics there. Everything that we were planning to look at, it's not gone away because of COVID. We need to make sure that we can pick these things back up, and hopefully organisations have been thinking about them. And some of these things around the ESG topics are going to be things that people have been looking at now because of COVID. And they need to make sure that we can continue to focus on them and bring them back to the forefront as well. I think, as I said before, COVID's been a bit of a, as Mark was saying as well, it's a short term. We need to think more in the medium to longer term, because we're going to have to coexist with this for a lot longer than we might have thought at the outset.
Brilliant, thank you, Craig. And just picking up on your point there about viability statements, what, in your experience, what have been some of the barriers to that stress testing and scenario analysis that perhaps weren't as forthcoming as they could have been?
And look, I'd like if a couple of the others could come in on this as well, because they've all seen a lot more than I have as well. And I think the main thing was always about this transparency point. there was very much a view, the viability statement was in there, but a bit of the get out was, well, we can't give too much in there because it starts to affect things, whether it's competitive advantage or whatever else. And often what it is, you don't have to be too specific when it comes to certain things within there. It's just about making sure that you've actually looked at these, you've stress tested, you've understood where those pain points might be. And now we produced our annual report in May time, which was slightly held up because of what was going on. We produced the sustainability report last month. We're now into interims. We're already thinking about next year's annual report. And all it is it's just making sure that we continue with these topics, keep them fresh and keep people talking about them and understanding, because fundamentally it's at the core of what you do within your financial areas of your business, around your budgeting, your forecasting, your understanding these pain points. So, I mean, if anybody else has got anything to add to that, because I'm sure that'll echo with what we've discussed in the past.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Alison, go on.
I was just going to add, I think part of it comes down to the point that was made earlier about transparency. And I think it's really been about, the scenarios have really been about being clear with particularly investors, but other key stakeholders, is if under these three scenarios, and I think the high quality reporters have been clear about what those scenarios are, this is what the financial and business model impacts look like as we roll through the next 6, 12, 18 months. And I think what we're starting to now see is people looking to a sort of a more medium, longer term in relation to what are the scenarios post-COVID or as we recover from COVID. So I think that transparency in conjunction with scenarios is sort of really helping other stakeholders understand what the potential impacts could be when ultimately we are dealing with an awful lot of unknown unknowns.
Yeah, I was going to say I couldn't agree more. I was speaking to an NED last week who's had two material uncertainties on the board, on the companies or the boards he sits on, and he was questioning why there hadn't been such a reaction from the market to these material uncertainties. And I think that, you know, it came down to one, I think the noise that is out there from the FRC and others, that they should expect more material uncertainties because of the scenarios we're going through, but also the level of transparency provided around from companies around the stress testing they've done, the scenarios they've done. And I think a lot of that, as Craig mentioned, we've been advocating for a number of years around viability statements. So it will be interesting to see how much of that translates into a more forward-looking discussion that the viability statement and if Bryden has his way, the resilience statement has. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Right. I think one of the impacts of COVID has obviously been the sort of unexpected nature of it. And my sense is because of that, this sort of view that viability statements should be really looking kind of far and wide to see the scenarios that could happen. And I think it could sort of push people outside, or the regulator could expect companies to go much further outside their sort of horizon of safe expectation, to be thinking more, what are the real black swan events? What are the things almost that we don't know, but if we think about it, actually become realistic things to consider within the viability statement? Because, you know, no one had pandemics in their viability statement, but clearly it's a very real risk and profound risk in terms of its economic consequence. I think that will add a reality to the expectations that are placed on companies, risk committees, whoever, to really take seriously that sort of scenario planning, that sort of scenario thinking that underpins then what they put in reality in their viability statements going forward.
Thank you, everyone. Alison, if I can put quite a specific question to you, actually. You sit on the board of several different companies across different sectors. How are companies considering ESG, diversity, and climate risks? And I guess some of those issues that have been brought to the fore in the aftermath of COVID. What are you seeing in terms of the way that companies are now looking at those topics?
Crikey. Yeah, lots there. I mean, I guess first and foremost, I mean, ESG has been on the minds of boards for some time, and probably G sort of formally more on E, and then I think COVID has really brought home to most boards and people at large the sort of societal impacts. So again, one of the big push around the corporate governance code was around, well, what's the purpose of an organization? And I think, you know, this pandemic has really caused boards and people individually to sort of stop and think about, well, what is the purpose of the organization? What's the value? And I think for me, ESG reporting is actually, are we really clear of the value that the organization brings in its widest context? I mean, clearly there is always a challenge around access to capital. And I think what we've really seen over the last 12 months, and it continues to accelerate, is that availability of capital, be it debt or equity, is being increasingly linked to ESG performance. So in the old sort of mantra of what gets measured gets done, I think that has seen a massive increase. I think there are some real challenges for particularly investor relations departments over which metrics, how does it get measured, how does it get reported. So I think we are seeing certainly the boards I sit on trying to focus on the most important, i.e. the things that are of most value, both in terms of what the organization contributes, but what it believes are most important to its stakeholders. So I think we'll see an even increasing focus around that. Specifically to your points around diversity first and then climate related risks, I think again we've seen a shift, you know, a huge amount of focus around gender over probably the last 4 or 5 years since the Davies report, and then various other requirements that have shifted the dial in relation to gender diversity, but an increasing focus for companies on what is more of a longer term plan in how they improve executive gender numbers, because obviously in building capability within an organization that takes longer, but certainly has focus. But again, I think increasingly both recent events in terms of things like Black Lives Matter, but I think before that, you know, the focus on building ethnicity within organizations has had a heightened spotlight. And I think again, as we reflect on the last 6 months, I think that will only increase. And then, you know, broader, I think people are recognizing the value of different ways of thinking. And indeed, I think one of my reflections of working with people remotely has been actually it's allowed people who are slightly more introverted than me to have a voice in the conversations. And so that diversity of personalities around a boardroom table, around an executive committee, I think is also just planting its seed with people. And then finally on climate related risks, I mean, certainly as an audit committee chair, this is probably one of my #1 topics for discussion in our sort of interim audit committees outside of the financial statements is what is our journey to TCFD reporting. And I think again, from an investor perspective, and I think Mark mentioned Mark Carney, who now having left the Bank of England is the UN's Special Envoy for Climate Change and was the co-sponsor of TCFD. You know, Mark made it very clear that I think ahead of COP26 next year, there is going to be an increasing focus on the quality of climate reporting from companies. And hence, from my perspective, the boards I'm involved in is where are we on that journey? What does the journey look like? And how do we communicate as we go forward? But I think individually as board members, but also within an organization, I think it really does call into question, do we have adequate competency to be able to address this question? Because it's a massive challenge. and therefore I think things like Chapter 0, which I've joined as a non-executive, I think being able to tap into some of this specialist support as we deal with some of these big questions, I think is also going to be important. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think, you know, it's such a broad area. I think it's going to be very hard for individual board members to have all the answers, but I think we have to collectively work together to address them.
Thanks, Alison. And I guess on that vein then, and just thinking about what you're saying about, you know, that sort of changing profile or expectations of the knowledge that board members should have. And I guess I'll probably open this question up to the floor, actually. Are you seeing shifts in that direction with perhaps, you know, different skill sets being brought into the business, or different committees or subgroups being established that can help to plug some of those knowledge gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly respond and then let others, but certainly a bit like when cyber risk first appeared and we saw sort of either board members or advisory board appointments, I can see things like climate or other wider ESG inputs coming into the board, either directly as non-executives or through some form of advisory capacity. And certainly I know it's an area that the proxy agencies have started picking up on. You know, is there adequate competency in relation to ESG on the board? So I think that pressure will only continue.
I think just sort of adding to what Alison was saying, I think we are in a season where the sort of role and competencies and understanding of board members is going through quite a rapid change. If you look at stakeholder engagement, and Mark mentioned this earlier, you know, there is no doubt that boards are having to embrace new discussions and kind of embark on new discussions, partly driven by the code, but also driven by this renewed focus on Section 172, to go into areas that I don't think boards have really engaged with previously. When you talk about employee engagement, or you talk about stakeholders, and just questions about, well, who are our stakeholders? Are they the same ones as the ones that are listed in Section 172, or actually are there other stakeholders, which for a lot of companies that is true, and how do we engage with them? And I think it does go to a sort of slightly wider discussion about how the role of the company and the purpose of companies is changing. And so I think, in a sense, COVID has kind of really taken that forward in its own way, because it's sort of challenged how you engage with your stakeholders in a particular, very urgent way. But it forms part of a broader stream of sort of board engagement and board discussion, which is actually uncomfortable for I think for a lot of directors, because it's not their comfort zone. It's not what they're used to. You know, they're used to discussing about shareholder value, capital flows, allocation of resources and tangible resources. And now they've got to talk about intangible things and intangible relationships. And I don't think this is going to go away. And then if you add the overlay of things like climate, which again has a sort of much broader perspective to it than just the immediate issue of the board and what it's focused on, you are seeing a massive change going on at the moment in boardrooms, not all of which is entirely comfortable for board members, I don't think.
I was just wanting to echo in what Alison and Chris have been saying, and particularly that last one about taking board members, directors into thinking that maybe they haven't previously had to consider. And part of it starts to come into now it's about longer term topics that people need to start to be considering. Things like climate change, environmental issues, the governance points, the social and everything else. I think from what Chris was saying, often it's been certain things that are in the immediate horizon people can get information on. Now it's about making decisions for the longer term. It's about properly being invested with things like the community. And I mean, part of that, I suppose the only practical example I can give really around a lot of that at the moment is where I am at Centamin. In 2018, we started a pretty broad succession plan for refreshing our board. And that's basically meant now almost the entire board's changed. We've got a new CEO who joined in April time as well. And a lot of the topics on the agenda are about the longer term thinking, particularly in the industry where I am, where mining, you generally have something that's a longer term operation that you can look at. And it's about thinking about that in a longer term and not so much in the short to medium term as you may have before. And it's about independence of thought, as well as bringing diversity to the board, where people think about things, approach things in a different way, and there's a level of challenge that may not have existed previously across a lot of organisations.
And I was just going to add that this sort of this journey that we think boards are on, it is almost mirrored in the quality, I suppose, of the disclosures we've seen to date. A large proportion of companies' management are comfortable in talking about stakeholder engagement as a process. Many organizations doing that already through the whole sustainability agenda, for instance, and therefore they've been able to extend and leverage. But if you then unpick it and say, well, what did you actually do with that engagement? What were the issues that arose? What impact did it have on decision making? And most importantly, I suppose for me, what was the role of the board? Then the quality of the discussion begins to taper off. And then if you take other aspects of the code, like the quality, whether the board's oversight of, challenge of, support of things like purpose and culture, then again, a lot of references to it because the code is encouraging it, but unpicking it to really understand what the board did and how that influenced the strategic decision making of management is, there are few and far between. And I think it's that journey, and with climate change. So I'm hopeful that we will see more transparency in governance reporting through the next reporting cycle, because a lot of it has been in the public domain already, and hopefully that is just the start of an improvement in the quality of governance reporting.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to deviate a little bit, actually, just to pick up on some of the things that have come out of that last bit of discussion. So we've talked quite a lot about, transparency being crucial, particularly from a listed companies perspective, where there's a need to build trust and take people on that journey and provide that information that stakeholders are looking for. We've also talked quite a lot about this focus on the longer term and the longer term outlook and the importance of stakeholder engagement. And obviously one of the purposes of the new UK corporate governance code was to broaden that definition of good governance and what that should encompass. So I guess based on what you've seen, either within your companies or looking at companies as a whole, what would you say that the uptake or response to the corporate governance code has been? Would you say that it has perhaps not had as big an impact as we might have thought a year ago prior to its introduction? Or is it just that, there's so much going on for companies and boards and executives to process, that actually it's probably going to be another 2 to 3 years before we start to see some traction in terms of the quality of those disclosures?
Shall I kick off on that one, Claire?
Go for it, Chris. Thank you.
I think, well, I have this view that whenever there is a code change introduced, you have almost a 2-year cycle of implementation, because the first year there is a lot of, well, what are we supposed to do? What's everyone else doing? Where is the thought leadership around this that we can kind of hang on to? And you go into that first annual report with the new changes with a degree of trepidation, and you are kind of looking over your shoulder and trying to see what other people are doing. And I always pity it's usually the September reporters who kind of get the spotlight upon them. And I think the more recent changes to the code, particularly the 2018 changes to the code, have not been changes that say, well, if you change this paragraph or you put this wording in, you can tick the box and say we've done the job. And I think in the earlier versions of the code, that tended to be what happened. If you had a bit of a discussion about this, put the right words in, it was, new code implemented, off we go. Now, particularly on the back of the sort of section 172 imperative that's driving a lot of the new code, with its sort of its real emphasis on how a board's doing their job, you've got to be supporting what you say by processes and discussions and minutes and so on that board is actually doing, or the relevant committee. And I think that's where the real challenge of this comes in, because in a sense, it repeating what we've said already, boards are actually having to do some real stuff to be able to say meaningful things. I think inevitably there will be degrees of reflection. Sometimes that will be led by people like the FRC, who will tell us what they think of what people have said. Others will look at what their peer groups of their peers have said and think, actually, that was good, that was useful. Let's sort of build on that. I think underpinning that all, I would say the good news is that boards have generally taken it all very seriously, and they have really had tried to think about it. Whether they feel they've got it right is it's up to them. I suspect a number think, well, we're not quite sure, but we'll see. But I do think that there has been a real sense of engagement with the issues being raised by the code and the legislation. But it is, as I said, that 2-year journey, which means I think there is reflection and sort of evolution required. And I think a lot of boards will be looking back at last year and then saying, okay, so how do we take it forward this year? And I think, notwithstanding the sort of urgency of other priorities created by COVID, it will certainly do a lot of listed company boards well to reflect on where they are in that sort of new codes journey, and see how they can move it forward into the next year's annual report.
Thank you, Chris. Mark, Craig, Alison?
I was just going to say, actually, the last few months have been a practical exercise in section 172, and one of the encouragements I've given CEOs and those responsible for the annual report is actually, can we capture now some of those decisions that we've taken and articulation of the impact on stakeholders that the last 6 months, 4 months have meant for them, and write some of those case studies or stories now, rather than waiting until the end of the year when the usual annual reporting timetable comes around, because I think it really has been a practical journey in stakeholder engagement and as I say, board decision making that's thought long and hard about workforce, suppliers, customers, the interaction with government. Do you take furlough? Do you not take furlough opportunities or government funding? Do you then repay it? So I think for businesses, they've been living and breathing it. I think it's just realizing that that's what the expectation was in terms of the code and how you articulate your story.
I was just going to go on from what Chris was saying with I suppose we've been talking about this a lot internally, and it's interesting that the code always is this kind of get out clause that was the comply or explain concept, that you had to comply with certain things or you could explain it, and different organisations approach that in different ways. You're now getting into, there's an expectation to comply and explain. And that's only getting more and more. That's the case. If you start to talk about the Bride and Review and everything else what's coming over the horizon, there's just going to be more around explaining, proving, and everything else. And that's not saying this is a bad thing, but it's just more, it's about giving some context and giving some flavour to what you're actually doing about something, rather than, as Chris was saying, you have to update this paragraph. Here's basically the wording of what you need to say, insert your company name here. I think it's a lot more about, and look, Mark and his team at PwC, when I worked with them a lot, they'd look at annual reports and they'd see the same after the same after the same in terms of some of the areas. And a lot of what they've been talking about is, how do you start to reflect your organisation and your company within your annual report, within your reporting, so it's not as if you could remove that company name and it could be anybody's annual report you're reading. And I think that's where a lot of this comes through. And then that's going on to what Alison was saying about these case studies. It's about bringing these things to life, and it's not just waiting about December, let's start preparing the annual report. It's about thinking about that throughout the entire year.
Thank you, Craig.
I feel like I should say so. I know, I feel like I should say something. I think what has been impressive has been the way companies have recognised this whole stakeholder agenda, the pressure on them to better demonstrate their wider impact. I think companies didn't wait for legislation to change to respond positively to the growing calls for more information about stakeholders and their wider impact. And so we've seen that over 2 years. What has been interesting is that, I've spoken to a lot of very engaged boards, very engaged audit committees or NEDs on the agenda. But it's been interesting to see the number of them that have sort of said, well, we're doing a lot of this already. And actually, when you start to unpick it, what you find is that a lot of the engagement is being done at the executive level or the functional level. The sales and marketing engage with customers, procurement engage with with suppliers, and so forth. And not a lot of that is coming up to the board in terms of, well, what should the board be doing and how are they taking into account some of these things? And I think it's taking time to formalize that, put the processes in place, and actually, to Alison's point, recognize when they are actually doing it and then be able to report on it. So I think some of these other more touchy-feely areas of the code around purpose and culture and long-term sustainability of the business model are going to take time to come out. I think that the companies that have been more progressive are the ones that were already debating their purpose or debating their culture or had exercises underway. And undoubtedly, that workforce engagement was the one thing that everyone took away from the code, and therefore everyone focused in on. If you talked about it, everyone wanted to know about what others were doing about workforce engagement. They didn't want to know what others were doing around culture or anything. So, I think as Chris says, let's give it a year or two before we start really lambasting the companies out there. But I think they are on a journey.
That's fair enough. Thank you, everyone. So looking ahead then, because we've talked a lot about where we are now in terms of what we're seeing and what's happening and some of the challenges that companies are grappling with now. But I guess looking ahead to next year and possibly beyond, what are some of the key topics? We've talked about climate change. Alison, you've talked about some of the challenges around diversity. Are there any other key topics that boards and audit committees should be thinking about looking further ahead?
I mean, I guess with many respects, when you're reporting, you're sort of naturally looking back. So there's an element of the sort of rear view mirror. And I think boards and particularly audit committees are going to be really giving a good hard look at the sort of risk management process-based emerging risks. Well, why wasn't pandemic risk on the agenda? So that thing that Chris touched upon in terms of looking more widely, and interestingly, the sort of WEF annual report of major risks. Pandemic has been there over many years, and then has sort of fallen off the top 10 risks. I suspect it's guaranteed to be up there in number one next year. And interestingly, if you look back just immediately after the financial crisis was sort of number 1 or 2 on the list. But I think, how do we bring in that external perspective into the sort of risk reporting? And I think both Mark and Craig have referenced Bryden. We'll have a much clearer view of the outcomes of the various audit reforms later in the year in terms of what will start to be legislated. And I think the forward-looking companies will start to, not do so much of the rear view mirror, but the forward view mirror of what's required coming out of those recommendations in terms of a resilience statement. Donald Bryden is very clear on, having a succinct public interest statement in the annual report. So what interests does the company serve? So I think thinking about that. Clearly, other areas of focus around fraud risk, which has probably been heightened through the pandemic, with cyber risk as well. And therefore, investors are going to start to look for enhanced controls reporting. And what does that? There was one of the parts that I thought was very clear to me as an audit committee, was having that sort of separate risk report and the 3-year assurance plan that sits alongside it. So again, it's not mandated yet, but to what extent do you start to think about, even if it's internally, what do those aspects of reporting look like? So that those would be my thoughts in terms of looking ahead. And again, number 1 for me is TCFD as well.
Thanks, Alison. Craig, would you add anything to that from a internal risk perspective?
Look, I think it's going on from what Alison said, and I mentioned earlier about there's been a bit of a shift where, of course, I've had it tongue-in-cheek slightly about why pandemic risk wasn't the number 1 risk that we'd have on the risk register already. And I think it's been that point where it's been around, it's been something that's discussed, but most organisations have a static set of principal risks, and they've not really changed slightly, and it's more about turning the dial and the new and emerging risks, which it's only something recently that's been put into annual reports and everything else. And all the time I've been working at risk, it's often where the change is. It's the stuff that you talk about, it's the stuff that you engage around, and it's the stuff, I think the key point Alison was talking about is generally when it comes to your annual report, it's a bit of a backwards looking document, and it becomes this hybrid between, this year we very much found it because COVID happened, COVID happened obviously a long time before, but in March it really blew up. We published in May, so there was a lot of expectations we were getting about how much were we going to talk about COVID, when ultimately you've got a 2019 backward-looking report. And so that's where it starts to come into it. It's looking forward, it's horizon scanning, it's building what Chris was saying and Alison mentioned, it's about what is coming next. And it's maybe starting to think about some of these left field topics and at least starting to engage on them. And a lot of what's materialised through COVID is things we've been talking about anyway. So going on from the ESG type of agendas, there's things around your supply chain. So how resilient is that? How sure you are? Because over the last decade, there's been a number of incidents, if you go back to the financial crisis, where supply chains have been shocked, have been disrupted. And again, people seem to look at it for a little bit of time and then it's kind of put on the shelf. So it's these types of things, your engagement with the government and the locations in which you're based, engagement with the communities, your people, it's just going to be all these topics that it's going to continue to focus on and consider it in a different ways, not just all under a COVID umbrella, but actually about wider type of risks you need to look at. So that's what I'm going to be doing. We are, as I mentioned before, when the annual report was produced, we're about to produce interims. We then have a bit of time before we start thinking about next year's annual report. But internally, the key thing I want is a regular discussion, debate, and it's looking forward, not looking backwards.
Thanks, Craig. So just on that then, do you think we're likely to see more detailed disclosure or reporting? And I'm not just talking about the annual report here, I guess I'm talking a bit more generally. Do you think we're likely to see increased disclosure around supply chain in terms of, what that supply chain looks like, what the potential risks are, and then, just focusing in much more on the impacts of that on a business?
Look, I'll start with that, and I think again that links to a number of different topics. If you approach the modern slavery and all these other things, which people have been expected to respond to, again, there was statements that people were making. They were looking at that. I mean, there's been a fairly high-profile incident in the UK recently around the supply chain, where there was an organisation who obviously, where they were having things produced and everything else has been scrutinised. And I think it is going to be that properly. A lot of organisations, if I just take where I am, we've spent a lot of time and effort, and we're continuing to scrutinise our supply chain, look at different suppliers, where are they coming from, do they meet the ethics that we have, and everything else. And I think that's just going to continue to be the case. But it's not about making something standalone. I think the thing that's key here, Claire, it's all around, if you start to talk about something, where's that located? How do you reference back to it? Because I think annual reports, some of them can become fairly unwieldy to a certain extent. And it's about how do you make sure you're focusing on the key areas, where you report on that, and how you link back to it as best as possible, rather than creating standalone things that just duplicate what you're saying.
Yeah.
Claire, you're on mute.
First one of the day. Thank you, Alison. Chris, can I ask you about what you're seeing in the proxy space in terms of, you know, we've talked a lot about the pressures on companies, but I'm quite interested to explore what kind of response that's getting, particularly from proxy advisors, you know, how they're reacting to some of the companies who are stepping up to the mark and providing more information around, you know, some of these areas. Are you able to give us a bit of an update on focus areas from a proxy perspective?
Yes, I mean, I think it's probably fairly well understood by most people who are watching this that you know, the AGM season came at exactly the wrong time from a COVID perspective. And if you go back to sort of March, April time, there was this, which is the height of the AGM season. You had this situation where a lot of companies had produced their annual reports or were so far down the road that, you know, they were past the point of no return, and were convening or had convened their AGMs. And so, if you like, the information going into the AGMs and into the proxy the proxy agency sort of analysis was pre-COVID, but the AGMs themselves were being held sort of during COVID, and putting to the side the specific logistical issues that sort of came with that, which did get quite challenging. I think the sort of the analysis in one sense was very much on the old world, whilst the AGMs themselves were sort of rushing to focus on what was happening with COVID. So, you know, a lot of AGM statements were focused around, you know, what boards were doing, what the impact was, and so on. But I think underlying it, some of the sort of the ongoing themes remained, albeit COVID sort of changed the perspective. So, you know, the traditional discussions around remuneration moved away from policy and bonus and long-term incentives to how were executives aligning themselves to what they were having to do in terms of pay reduction, furloughing, and so on. And there is a legacy to that, I think, that will carry forward into next year, which is that companies and boards and executives in particular will be judged by how they dealt with things like furloughing and their own pay sort of outcomes as you go into sort of next year's AGM season. And I think a lot of the agencies will be looking to see a sense of alignment, which in a way carries on that sort of stakeholder element, which does impact on remuneration as much as anything else. But I think also the underlying trends of what shareholders are interested in, and what the proxy agencies and indeed some of the larger investors like BlackRock and Legal & General and so on, you know, the underlying themes of what they're focused on, I don't think will change. You know, they are into those sort of broader issues that we've talked about, like climate change. There may be a kind of resurrection of the focus on Brexit, because that now is coming back into the fore as the date becomes imminent. I think they will be driven by what's happening kind of in the world. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we get much more focus on ethnicity as a as a diversity issue, as well as gender. And we may well see more of the sort of stakeholder engagement piece. So, you know, I think I'm sure that the proxy agencies will have a lot to say for themselves over the coming months as they get into their sort of policy making seasons. But I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be much of a change in the sort of direction of travel, albeit there may be some variants to that come out of COVID and how companies responded to it, which give you sort of a sort of specific focus on certain board actions during the year.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just going to take this opportunity to say to everyone who's watching us that you can submit any questions you have on our chat function. We're going to wrap up in the next 9 minutes. So if anybody does have any questions that they want to put to the panel, please do send those through.
You've muted yourself again.
You're on mute, Claire.
Oh no, fail. I'm going to go around the table and ask everyone to summarize their top 3 takeaways or pointers in terms of the risk and governance outlook. So what are the 3 key things that you would say to anyone listening today? And I'll go to Mark first.
Oh, pressure. So 3 things that they need to be thinking about for the year ahead.
Either pointers or takeaways, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say climate change is a major issue and you need to be on that agenda, undoubtedly. That's not going away, so that's 1. 2, I think challenge yourself around breaking down the barriers or boundaries within your annual report to report an effective, strategically focused story. And by that I mean we're all just in the last 50 minutes we've thrown a whole lot of new content we think companies should be talking about in their annual report, and that is only going to drive us further and further away from a clear the clutter sort of agenda. And I think there is an opportunity for companies to start to think about how they better utilize the space they've got and draw closer alignment between some of the things talked about from a strategic perspective in the strategic report and reported elsewhere, rather than having to be repetitive and indeed inconsistent at times. So I think that's the second one. And third one, I think it's been mentioned, I think there will be a challenge about how companies can be more forward-looking in their annual reports. A document that has stubbornly remained backward-looking. I think, you know, your audience will be wanting to know what you are doing as a business to ensure the long-term sustainability of your business model coming out of this crisis. And I think that will be, you know, how do we take the lessons we've learned from short-term focus on going concern and scenarios, and how do we apply that to a more forward-looking orientation?
Thank you very much, Mark. Alison, you look like you're ready to go, so I'll come to you next.
Yeah, that's before the shutdown at 4 o'clock when the lights go off in South Africa. I think very much linking to Mark's last point, you know, articulating a sustainable business strategy. So rather than a sustainability strategy, I think that articulation is going to be really important for the long term. And I think the importance, and somebody mentioned it earlier, of the inherent intangible value that sits within the organization, you know, built off its public interest, its purpose, and the value that it brings to that wider stakeholder group. And I think it also has to be grounded in reality. So my third point is really about making sure the words and the deeds are aligned. So practically, what is it that boards and executive members of the team are going to be doing that really is walking the walk in relation to the long term?
Thank you, Alison. Craig?
I don't know how to follow on from there with the, but I think like some touching further on what they were saying and what I've been looking at. I think it's about properly having a discussion on risk. I'd ask you within your organisation to challenge yourself. Do you properly talk about these topics? Do you think about things moving into the future? So the whole concept of new and emerging was not just to put a few things on there because you needed to fill that space underneath your principal risk. It's about properly giving some flavour on what's been driving your organisation. So the first one is to just make sure you properly table in the discussion and risk where that's been discussed, who's involved in that. So from the bottom up, across the business, and from the top down, from the board, the executives and everyone else. The next one would then be taking the lessons learned. If you've been involved in how you've responded to COVID, is how do you take the positives from this in terms of what you've had to do as an organisation and take that forward? Everybody here has been talking about some of the things around how it's meant you've had to engage with your stakeholders properly, you've had to engage with the government. It's going to be all these topics, and it's about properly telling that story. And then I think it's just going to be reiterating a point that both Mark and Alison touched on, that is that point around the forward-looking nature of these things. How do you start to look into the future, and how do you start to think about things in a different way?
Thank you very much, Craig. And Chris?
Yes, I guess this is similar themes to what's been said already. I think in recent years, there has been a great emphasis on bringing the governance section of annual reports forward as a meaningful narrative rather than just a sort of set of boilerplate disclosures. And I think one of the opportunities that this year gives, with all of the challenges that boards have faced through COVID and other things, is actually to talk about the board's journey as a way of illustrating how the board works. And so I would certainly encourage those who have the joy of writing governance sections to think more in terms of that rather than, okay, what does code provision, 1 say, and 2 and 3 and 4. And I think you may actually find it a more enriching experience to write it in that way than in that sort of board journey way than the other sort of rather religious, going through the provisions. I think the second thing, one of the things I firmly believe about the past few months is that it's really found out a lot of companies and really shown, people are remembering the companies that have probably not done as well through COVID in some of the decisions and steps they've taken. And by the same token, I think companies who've been very fair in their approach to things like furloughing and executive pay and so on, are being recognised for that. And I think it just highlights the need to really emphasise how purpose and values really work within companies. And so, again, you could use the example of this year, but certainly I sense that there will be that focus on purpose and values. And I think, I suppose my final thing is, don't let COVID define how you describe your year, because there's an awful lot of other stuff going on, Black Lives Matter, Brexit, cyber, technology, if you take today's news around Huawei, and so it goes on. And I think the boring reports will be the ones that just talk about COVID and nothing else. So kind of don't let COVID define your year would be my third piece of advice, I think.